Okay, so welcome. So in this video, I'm going to talk about like fractions, common denominators, and the least common denominator. Okay, so again, take notes because I'm going to be talking about this, and I'm going to also bring in equivalent fractions as well. So like fractions are fractions that I say are of the same kind. Okay, and I've mentioned this before. Okay, so and I use this in quotes because it's a way of naming the fractions, right? We have fifths, we have sixths, we have thirds, we have halves, right? And we cannot add fractions that are not of the same kind or family of fractions, if you will, okay? So you could replace this with family as well, okay? In other words, another is just basically of saying this is like fractions or fractions that have the same denominator, right? If they're the same kind of fraction, actually, no, I take that back. Don't use family because I used family in a different context before. So just let's stick with kind, okay? So fractions with the same denominator are of the same kind of fractions. So they're all thirds or they're all fifths, okay? So not family. That was used differently. What else? Oh, common denominator. Okay, so what do we mean by common denominator? It's very similar to like fractions, right? Like fractions are fractions that have the same denominator. So what we say is those fractions have a common denominator. So common denominator is just a term that we use to describe that fractions have the same denominator. Okay, so we say that they have a common denominator, and this is true when we want to add fractions. We want them to be of the same kind. So one of the ways is to find equivalent fractions that do have a common denominator, right? So if I want to add 1/2 and 1/3 together, well, I can't add them because they're not of the same kind, but I can find equivalent fractions that are equivalent to 1/2 and is equivalent to 1/3 and add those together. Okay? So now that brings us to least common denominator, because we don't want to get too big, right? We don't want a big denominator or common denominator. We want the smallest common denominator. It'll make adding the fractions easier. Plus, we'll have to reduce, right? And if we have to reduce, we don't want to reduce too much. Okay? So, because it might be tedious to do that. So always start with the least common denominator. And how do we get the least common denominator? By finding the least common multiple of the denominators. Okay, that's how we're going to do it. Okay, the least common denominator is going to be the least common multiple of all of the denominators. Okay, and so next we'll do some examples and go from there.